In 1960, Finance Minister Goh Keng Swee pointed across Jurong marshland where he wanted factories built. One problem, almost no company had agreed to come. Critics called it Goh's folly. Today, the same western edge anchors advanced manufacturing, and Singapore produces about 1/10 of the world's chips. Singapore did not transform in one leap. It moved through 5 economic stages, and each stage solved a problem created by the last. How did a trading port build an economy for the world and change life inside a home? Singapore was never simply a fishing village. It was already an important entrepot. Ships brought goods in, merchants traded them, and ships carried them out. Its location was valuable. Its economy was dangerously narrow. In 1959, unemployment was estimated at about 14%. The domestic market was tiny. Separation ended hopes for a Malaysian common market, and British withdrawal threatened more jobs. Singapore could not sell enough to itself, so it chose to manufacture for foreign consumers, invite capital, import materials, export finished goods. That was the first stage. Now the strategy needed a place to work. The government created the Economic Development Board in 1961 and began clearing Jurong. It offered prepared industrial land, infrastructure, tax incentives, and a promise that agencies would solve investor problems quickly. At first, the gamble looked like failure. Only about 24 factories were operating by 1963. Empty buildings were not an economy. The state kept courting companies and improving the conditions they would need. In 1968, National Semiconductor opened a plant with remarkable speed. Fairchild, Texas Instruments, Hewlett-Packard, and others followed. Foreign companies brought orders, machinery, and know-how that Singapore did not yet possess. Jurong answered the first question: companies would come. Now Singapore had to turn their factories into durable jobs. By 1970, Jurong contained 264 factories and employed 32,000 workers. Garments, wigs, mosquito coils, and simple electronics were not glamorous, but they absorbed labor quickly. By the mid-1970s, Singapore was near full employment. Factory pay entered households, and workers learned industrial routines, quality control, and technical skills. But success changed the arithmetic. Labor became scarcer, wages rose, and nearby economies could compete for low-cost assembly. The cheap factory model that had created jobs could not keep raising them. Singapore needed a second transformation. An investor was not buying a tax break. It was buying a functioning city. The port had to release components on time. Power and water had to be reliable. A trained worker had to reach the factory healthy, housed, and ready. HDB attacked an acute housing shortage from 1960. Within 3 years, it built more than 21,000 flats, many with modern sanitation. Home ownership began in 1964, and from 1968, CPF savings could help pay for an HDB flat. Education moved with industry. Vocational institutes and the Singapore Technical Institute trained tradespeople and technicians. English connected workers and managers to international business, while technical subjects matched a changing factory floor. Housing created stability, education created capability, infrastructure created trust. Together, they made Singapore more than a cheap location. They made it reliable. Singapore's position beside major sea lanes was inherited. Its port advantage was built. It invested early in containerization, opening Tanjong Pagar Container Terminal in 1972, before container traffic took off across the region. When global container trade accelerated after 1975, Singapore was ready. Ships could transfer cargo, refuel, repair, and buy services in one place. The same logic turned an apparent weakness into another industry. Singapore had no domestic oil fields, yet imported crude, refined it beside deep water, and exported higher-value products. Infrastructure made every handoff faster. The port, factories, and refinery now reinforced one another. But they also raised wages and expectations again. By the late 1970s, the problem was no longer simply unemployment. It was value. If every worker hour cost more, each worker hour had to produce more. Singapore began discouraging activities that survived only on cheap labor and attracting precision engineering, electronics, petrochemicals, and capital-intensive production instead. This was the reversal of the entire story. The first model had worked so well that keeping it would make the country less competitive. Singapore's habit would be to abandon yesterday's advantage before it disappeared. Rollet trained thousands in precision engineering. Semiconductor firms built an electronics base. Disk drive makers arrived in the 1980s, and Singapore later became the world's leading producer. Customers mattered. A large company needed suppliers, technicians, standards, logistics, and finance. Each investment made the next one easier because more of the system already existed. From the 1980s, Singapore also expanded internationally tradable services: finance, aviation, tourism, professional services, and regional headquarters. In the 1990s and 2000s, it added biomedical manufacturing, research, and more advanced electronics. The economy had moved from many low-cost jobs to more skilled and valuable functions. Singapore was no longer offering only a factory site. It was offering a place to control regional operations, capital, and technology. This long upgrading cycle depended on institutions that could commit for decades: land assembly, ports, housing, schools, savings rules, and industrial agencies. The People's Action Party has governed continuously since 1959. Supporters argue that continuity reduced policy reversals and made long projects easier to execute. Singapore also built a reputation for low corruption and administrative predictability. But continuity was not free of political cost. Freedom House rates Singapore partly free and says the system allows some pluralism while constraining opposition and freedoms of expression, assembly, and association. The economic result and the political bargain belong in the same story. State capacity helped Singapore keep climbing. Concentrated power also narrowed the space in which citizens could challenge how the climb was managed. An economy is not a skyline. Its meaning is inside a home. First came a stable job, then a flat with piped water and sanitation. CPF linked wages to savings, and from 1968 to housing. Education opened routes into technical and professional work. The national figures show the scale, with caveats. Home ownership among resident households rose from 58.8% in 1980 to 90.8% in 2024. Median monthly employment income per resident employed households reached $12,027 in 2025. That income is before taxes and transfers and includes employer CPF contributions. It is a midpoint, not every family's experience. Life expectancy rose from 64.5 years in 1965 to a preliminary 83.9 in 2025. The life expectancy series changes population definitions after 1980, so it is not perfectly like for like. But the household chain is clear. Foreign orders became pay. Housing became security and an asset. Education became higher value work. Sanitation and healthcare became longer lives. Zoom out, and the improbability becomes physical. Singapore has only about 740 square kilometers of land and a population of just over 6 million. Yet beside it runs one of the world's busiest maritime corridors. The Straits of Malacca and Singapore carry about 1/3 of global trade. Geography made this location valuable. Policy turned that value into an economy. By GDP per person, Singapore now stands above the United States, Germany, Japan, and China. That number is not household income, and it does not erase high living costs, but it captures the scale of the transformation. A small island, once searching for jobs, became one of the world's most productive economies. Success has not removed the constraint, it has changed it. Singapore is wealthier, but also older, more expensive, and still limited by land. Its port, industries, skills, finance, and institutional trust must now be reinvented for a world of slower growth and fiercer competition. In 1960, Goh Keng Swee pointed across empty Jurong and asked whether this place could survive. Singapore answered that question through 5 transformations. The question now is whether an island this small has a 6th transformation left, and whether it can keep raising the quality of life inside the homes the first 5 helped build.